A ranch on the edge of ruin, a cowboy haunted by grief, a widow mocked by an entire town. When Wyatt Sterling hires Abby Thornton as his cook, he thinks he is only saving his empty kitchen. But the woman who cannot carry a tray without dropping it may be connected to the very land he is fighting to protect. Is she a blessing, a betrayal, or the only person strong enough to save him from himself? If you enjoyed this journey, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, share the story with someone who loves Western drama, and subscribe to stay with us on the next ride.
5 in the morning. The Texas heat didn't wait for the sun. It just sat heavy in the dust, waiting for a man to wake up. Wyatt Sterling swung the hammer. Iron struck iron. A sharp, rhythmic ringing echoed off the canyon walls. It sounded like a heartbeat in an empty house. He wiped a drop of sweat from his brow. His hands were calloused, thick from years of holding reins and swinging tools. He wasn't a tall man, nor classically handsome. He was built like the land itself, weathered, tough, and quiet. He didn't really need to fix this fence line today. But he needed to hit something. Something he could control. He moved down the line, pulling another heavy post from the pile. He stopped just short of the last post in the row. The wood there was older, weathered gray by the brutal summers. Carved into the side were 2 letters and a year. SS. 1871. Sarah Sterling. 6 years gone. Taken by a fever that swept through the valley. Wyatt didn't look at the carving. He never did. He just adjusted his thick leather gloves, gripped the handle of his hammer, and kept moving. That was rule number 1 of surviving Dust Creek. You don't look back. You don't ask for help. You don't need anyone, so you don't have to lose anyone. Hoofbeats broke the morning quiet. Wyatt leaned his weight on the hammer handle. He watched a black buggy roll up the dirt track, kicking up a trail of fine red dust. Punctual. That was the worst thing about Silas Vance. A man could easily hate a villain. It was damn near impossible to hate a polite, quiet banker who showed up exactly when he said he would, carrying perfectly legal papers. Silas climbed down from the buggy. He dusted off his dark trousers. He looked entirely out of place out here, a man of ledgers standing in a world of cattle and scrub brush. "Morning, Wyatt." "Silas." "Dry heat today." "Always is." Wyatt didn't offer him coffee. He hadn't made any. Silas pulled a folded piece of heavy paper from his breast pocket. He didn't look happy about it. 60 days, Wyatt, $340. Or the bank takes the Eastern Tract. Wyatt looked at the paper, then at the banker. "I know the terms of my own loan." Silas sighed. The man looked tired, older than his 52 years. "Look, Wyatt, I don't want your land. I need the cash. You know about my little girl, the medicine in Dallas. It ain't getting any cheaper. The bank needs liquidity, and I need my salary to keep my daughter breathing." It wasn't an excuse. It was just a fact. And that was exactly what made the whole situation a bitter pill to swallow. There was no bad guy here, just hard times and bad luck. "Sell a few head of cattle," Silas offered, his voice dropping to a softer, almost pleading tone. "Buy yourself some time." "That herd is my father's legacy," Wyatt said. His voice was flat, hard, unyielding. "I'm not selling off my family's work to buy time I can't afford. You'll get your money, or you'll get the deed. Either way, we're done here for today." Silas nodded slowly. He understood a proud man when he saw one. He climbed back into his buggy. 60 days, Wyatt. Don't make me send the sheriff." Wyatt watched him ride away. Then he turned and walked back toward the main house. The kitchen was dead. No fire in the stove. No smell of bacon or chicory. Just a cold, empty room. Jesse, his 19-year-old brother, was sitting at the wooden table. He was staring at a cold tin plate, looking completely lost. "Walt's gone," Jesse said, not looking up. "Packed his bags in the middle of the night. Headed north with that silver mining crew." Wyatt closed his eyes, pinched the bridge of his nose. Of course he did. The cattle needed tending. The fall hay season was breathing down their necks, threatening double shifts. Men couldn't swing scythes and rope calves on empty stomachs. Jesse couldn't cook a potato without turning it into charcoal. Wyatt wasn't much better. He needed a cook. Today. "Saddle my horse," Wyatt said. Dust Creek wasn't much of a town. A general store, a bank, a modest church, and Martha Higgins' diner. It was a place where folks minded everybody's business but their own. Wyatt tied his horse to the hitching post outside the diner. The sun was fully up now, baking the wooden boardwalks. Before his boots even hit the timber, he heard the crash. Porcelain shattering. A loud, sharp, violent sound, followed instantly by laughter. Mean, echoing laughter. Wyatt pushed through the swinging saloon-style doors. The diner was packed with morning patrons, mostly ranch hands, drifters, and a few local shopkeepers. They were all turned around in their chairs, pointing and looking toward the kitchen doors. There, kneeling on the hard wooden floor, was a woman. She was frantically gathering the sharp pieces of a broken serving platter. Her hands were shaking. She had dull red hair, laced heavily with silver, falling loosely into her face. Her apron was stained with coffee and gravy. She didn't look up. Standing over her was Martha Higgins, the diner's owner. Her face was flushed red with fury. "Get out!" Martha hissed. Her voice carried easily over the quieted room. "Just get your things and get out, Abby. You are a walking disaster." The woman, Abby, didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She just kept picking up the porcelain shards, cutting her thumb in the process. "I'll pay for the platter, Mrs. Higgins. Just take it from my week's pay." Her voice was soft, carrying a gentle lilt from somewhere up in Missouri. "You can't afford the plates you break," Martha yelled. She turned to the laughing crowd, playing directly to her audience. "3 times this week, she spills the hot coffee, she drops the plates, she leaves the stove door open. No man would ever take in a woman who only knows how to ruin things. You're a joke, Abigail Thornton. A clumsy, useless joke of a woman." The laughter swelled. A few men slapped the wooden tables. "Send her back to St. Louis," one of them shouted. Wyatt stood frozen by the door. He watched the woman carefully place the last broken piece into the fold of her apron. She didn't cry. She didn't shrink away from the noise. She simply stood up. Her spine was remarkably straight. She kept her eyes fixed firmly forward and walked toward the back alley door. Something tight and hot gripped Wyatt's chest. He didn't like mobs, he didn't like bullies, and he hated the sound of people laughing at someone who was already on the ground. He stepped forward. His heavy riding boots struck the wooden floor. Thud, thud. The diner fell silent. The laughter died in their throats. People in Dust Creek knew Wyatt Sterling. They knew the quiet, brooding veteran didn't take kindly to nonsense. They parted ways as he walked straight through the center of the room. He walked right past Martha Higgins, ignoring her completely, and pushed open the back door. She was standing in the dusty alleyway. She was untying the strings of her ruined apron. Her hands. Wyatt noticed them immediately. They were covered in old burn scars and fresh little cuts, evidence of a woman who fought a daily war in the kitchen. "Mrs. Thornton," Wyatt said. She turned slowly. She didn't look scared. She just looked incredibly tired. "If you followed me out here to laugh, mister, you can go right back inside. The show is over." "I don't laugh much," Wyatt said. He stepped off the back porch into the alley. "I'm here to hire a cook." Abby blinked. She looked at him like he had lost his mind. "You want to hire me? Did you not just see what happened in there?" "I saw exactly what happened in there," Wyatt said. He closed the distance between them. The alley was quiet, away from the cruelty of the crowd. He looked her dead in the eyes. He needed her to understand that he wasn't offering charity. Wyatt stood tall, his voice dropping into a steady, commanding rhythm. "Let me tell you something, Mrs. Thornton, and I mean every word. A person's worth is not measured by whether they clumsily drop a plate. It is measured by the honest sweat they shed trying to survive in a hard world. What those people did in there, mocking a woman's struggle to earn a living, that is pure cowardice. It is a failure of basic human decency. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect and equal dignity, regardless of how graceful their hands happen to be. No one has the right to strip you of your pride. Abby stared at him. Her lips parted slightly. The morning air seemed to hold its breath. Nobody had ever spoken to her like that. Not in Missouri, not in Texas. Nobody had ever stood up and spoken those words out loud. Wyatt cleared his throat, suddenly realizing how much he had just said. He shifted back to business. "My name is Wyatt Sterling. I run a cattle outfit a few miles out of town. The pay is terrible," he continued, his tone flat again. "I can't afford much. The hours are long. The ranch is isolated. You'll be cooking for me, my brother, and 2 hands. But I can promise you one thing. Nobody will ever laugh at you in my kitchen. Do you want the job?" Abby looked down at her scarred, trembling hands. She took a slow breath. Then she looked back up at the cowboy standing before her. "Yes," she said. No bargaining, no hesitation, no asking about the exact wages or the living arrangements. Just a simple, quiet yes. "Get your things," Wyatt said. "My wagon is out front." He turned and walked back toward the street. As he walked, his brow furrowed. He didn't understand it. A woman with any other options would have negotiated. She would have asked for $1 more. But she just accepted. Why? The question settled deep in his mind. Stubborn. Unresolved. As the blazing Texas sun finally broke full over the horizon, Wyatt realized he had just invited a mystery into his quiet, lonely life. And for the first time in 6 years, he felt something other than grief. He felt curious. Wyatt woke at 4:30. It was a habit carved into his bones. The Texas morning was still pitch black. The air inside his small bedroom was cool, holding on to the last breath of night. He sat up, swung his legs over the edge of the mattress. His boots hit the floorboards with a dull thud. For 6 years, the mornings had been his, quiet, predictable, just him, the ghosts of the past, and a pot of black coffee he boiled himself. Today was different. Before he even reached the hallway, he heard it. A sharp clatter, metal hitting iron. Then a soft, frustrated sigh. Wyatt stopped in the doorway of the kitchen. Abby was already there. She was fully dressed, a faded blue cotton dress and a clean white apron. Her gray-streaked red hair was pinned up, but a few strands had already escaped, clinging to her sweaty neck. The cast-iron stove was roaring, too hot for this early in the morning. She turned around fast, too fast. Her elbow caught the handle of a tin cup sitting on the counter. It tumbled to the floor. It didn't break. Tin rarely did, but it made a racket loud enough to wake the dead. She froze. She looked at the cup. Then she looked up and saw Wyatt standing in the shadows. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice was quiet, resigned, like a dog waiting to be kicked. Wyatt didn't move. He looked at the cup. He looked at her. He walked into the kitchen, bent down, and picked up the tin. He set it quietly on the wooden table. "Coffee smells different," he said. That was all. No reprimand, no shouting. Abby blinked. She wiped her hands on her apron. "It's a Missouri blend. Got a little chicory in it. Makes it stretch further. Brews stronger, too." Wyatt nodded. He sat down at the head of the table. He didn't ask her to serve him, but she did. Her hand shook just a fraction as she poured the dark liquid into his mug. A few drops splashed onto the scrubbed pine wood. She quickly wiped it up with a rag. Wyatt took a sip. It was bitter, earthy. It tasted nothing like the thin, watery brew the old cook used to make. It tasted rich. It tasted like someone actually cared about what went into the pot. "It's good," he said. Abby turned back to the stove. She didn't smile, but her shoulders dropped a half-inch. The rest of the camp woke an hour later. Jesse stumbled into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his young eyes. The 2 ranch hands, a weathered old drifter named Silas, and a quiet kid they called Dutch, followed close behind. They took their seats. They expected the usual: burnt bacon, hard biscuits, silence. Abby brought the food to the table. She carried a heavy iron skillet in both hands. Sizzling salt pork, thick gravy, a mountain of fresh cornbread. She set the skillet down, a little too hard. The gravy sloshed over the sides, sizzling as it hit the hot iron. Jesse smirked. He nudged Dutch under the table. Wyatt saw it. He didn't say anything. Not yet. He took a piece of cornbread, he flipped it over. The bottom edge was charred black, burnt. He looked at Abby. She was standing by the counter watching them. She saw him inspecting the burnt edge. She didn't apologize. She didn't make an excuse about the draft in the chimney or the unfamiliar stove. She just looked back at him, holding her ground. Wyatt took a bite. The burnt crust was bitter. But the inside was soft, sweet, perfect. He ate the whole piece. The men ate like starving wolves. Nobody complained about the burnt edges. Nobody complained about the spilled gravy. Because the food was incredible. It was the first real meal this house had seen in half a decade. But the peace didn't last. It never does when young men are involved. Dinner that evening was a heavy beef stew, the kind that sticks to your ribs after a long day in the saddle. The kitchen was hot. The air was thick with the smell of onions, seared meat, and thyme. Abby was carrying a large ceramic serving bowl to the table. It was heavy, searing hot. She held it with two thick rag holders. She stepped toward the table. Her boot caught the uneven edge of a floorboard. She stumbled. She didn't fall, but the bowl pitched forward. A wave of hot, thick broth splashed over the rim. It hit the floor, splattered across Jesse's boots. Abby gasped. She set the bowl down hard on the table. The ceramic cracked against the wood, but held. Lord Almighty! Jesse jumped back, kicking his chair away. Watch what you're doing, woman! Abby immediately dropped to her knees. She grabbed a towel and started wiping the hot broth off the floorboards. Her face was flushed deep red. Her breathing was shallow, fast. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The board. I didn't see the board. Jesse let out a loud, harsh laugh. He looked at the ranch hands, seeking an audience. Well, Martha Higgins wasn't lying. We hired ourselves the clumsy cook. Can't even walk across a flat floor without wearing half the supper on my boots. Dutch chuckled. Silas looked down at his plate. Wyatt stopped eating. He set his fork down. The metal clinked against the tin plate. In the sudden quiet of the room, it sounded like a gunshot. He didn't yell. He didn't slam his fist on the table. He just looked at his younger brother. His eyes were cold, flat, dangerous. Sit down, Jesse, Wyatt said. His voice was dangerously soft. Jesse's smile vanished. He looked at Wyatt. He swallowed hard. He slowly pulled his chair back and sat down. Wyatt leaned forward. He rested his heavy forearms on the table. He didn't look at Abby on the floor. He kept his eyes locked on Jesse. Listen to me closely, Jesse, Wyatt said. The words came out slow, deliberate, a measured rhythm of undeniable authority. And I want you to remember this for the rest of your life. The room was dead silent. The only sound was the crackle of the wood in the stove. A person's worth, Wyatt began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction, is not measured by whether they clumsily drop a bowl. It is not measured by a ruined apron or a burnt piece of bread. It is measured by the honest sweat they shed trying to put food on our table. Jesse looked down. His cheeks burned red. Wyatt wasn't finished. Mocking a woman's hard work is cowardice. It is not a joke. It is the cheapest, weakest thing a man can do. That woman on the floor has been working since 4 a.m. to feed you, to keep your belly full so you can ride. On this ranch, every individual is equal in respect. Do you understand me? Jesse nodded, keeping his eyes on his plate. Yes, sir. Then you will apologize. Now. Jesse looked up. He looked down at Abby, who was still kneeling, clutching the gravy-soaked rag. I'm sorry, Mrs. Thornton, Jesse mumbled. Speak like a man, Wyatt snapped. Jesse sat up straighter. I am sorry, Mrs. Thornton. It was out of line. Abby slowly stood up. She didn't look at Jesse. She looked at Wyatt. For the first time since she had arrived in Dust Creek, someone had drawn a line in the sand for her. Someone had demanded that she be treated like a human being. Her chest tightened. She felt an unfamiliar burning behind her eyes, but she didn't cry. "The stew is getting cold," Abby said softly. She turned and walked back to the stove. Wyatt picked up his fork. "Eat," he told the men. They ate in silence. It wasn't a comfortable silence, but it was a respectful one. And in a hard land like Texas, respect was a damn good place to start. The hay harvest came early in September. It was the hardest time of the year. The Texas sun turned the sky into a white-hot forge. The air was thick with dust, pollen, and the sharp, sweet smell of cut grass. It was grueling work. The men swung heavy iron scythes for 14 hours a day. Shoulders burned, blisters popped and bled. Tempers ran short. Wyatt worked the line right alongside his men. He didn't believe in giving orders from the shade. He swung his scythe in a steady, punishing rhythm. Swish, thud, swish, thud. By noon, the canteens were dry. The men were slowing down, panting like overrun horses. Wyatt wiped his brow with the back of his leather glove. He squinted against the glaring sun, looking toward the main house on the ridge. A figure was walking down the dirt path. It was Abby. She was carrying 2 large wooden buckets on a yoke across her shoulders. They were filled to the brim with fresh well water. The yoke looked too big for her. The buckets looked too heavy. The path was steep, rutted with dried wagon tracks. It wasn't a woman's job. Normally, they would send a young boy from town to run water. But they didn't have a boy. They just had Abby. Wyatt stopped swinging. He leaned on his scythe, watching her. She walked with her head down, concentrating on every step. Her dress was already dark with sweat around the collar. The buckets swayed. Water sloshed over the sides, hitting the dry dirt in dark, heavy drops. Halfway down the hill, her boot caught a hidden rock. She stumbled forward. The yoke shifted violently. One of the buckets hit the ground hard, spilling a quarter of its water over her heavy skirt and the dry grass. Wyatt tensed. His instinct was to drop his tool and run up the hill, to take the heavy load from her shoulders, but he didn't. He stayed planted. Because he realized in that split second that running to her would humiliate her. It would prove the town right, that she was fragile, that she couldn't handle the work. So he watched. Abby didn't cry out. She didn't sit down in the dirt and weep. She took a deep breath. She reached down, grabbed the handle of the fallen bucket, and hoisted it back into place. Her skirt was soaked with mud. Her hair was flying loose in the hot wind. She set her jaw, adjusted the yoke, and kept walking. When she reached the men, she set the buckets down in the shade of an old oak tree. She pulled a tin dipper from her apron pocket. "Water?" she called out. Her voice was hoarse from the dust, but steady. The men dropped their tools and hurried over. They drank greedily. Jesse poured half a dipper over his head, sighing in relief. Wyatt walked over last. He took the dipper from her hands. Their fingers brushed. For a second, just a heartbeat. Her skin was rough, calloused, hot. He drank the cold water. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. He handed the dipper back. "You didn't have to carry both at once." Abby wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist. She looked out over the freshly cut field. "Men can't harvest if they're passing out from the heat, Mr. Sterling. The job needed doing." She picked up the empty buckets, turned around, and started the long walk back up the hill. Wyatt watched her go. The mud dried on her hem, turning to gray dust. She wasn't graceful. She wasn't delicate. But she was the strongest damn thing he had seen in a long time. The harvest lasted 3 weeks. By the end of it, a shift had happened on the ranch. It was subtle, invisible to anyone looking from the outside, but Wyatt felt it. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was comfortable. When Wyatt sat on the porch in the evenings, carving wood or repairing leather tack, Abby would sit on the far end of the bench, snapping beans or mending shirts. They didn't talk much. The Texas night was usually loud enough, filled with the hum of cicadas and the distant howl of coyotes. But the distance between them had changed. It had shrunk. It was the final night of the harvest. The men had gone into town to drink away their wages. Wyatt and Abby were alone at the ranch. Wyatt walked into the kitchen to grab a lantern. The fire in the stove was banked to a low red glow. Abby was sitting at the table. She wasn't mending clothes, she wasn't cleaning pots. She was reading. A thick, heavy book lay open in front of her. She had a pencil in one hand, tracing the lines of text in the dim light of a single oil lamp. Wyatt paused. He stepped closer. He looked at the cover. The gold lettering was faded but readable. Practical farming in arid climates. Soil retention and crop rotation. It was a complex book, the kind taught in the agricultural colleges up north. It wasn't a romance novel or a book of poetry. It was pure, hard science. Abby heard his boots on the floorboards. She looked up. She didn't slam the book shut or try to hide it. She just met his gaze calmly. "I thought you were in the barn," she said. Wyatt gestured to the book. "Where did you get that?" "Brought it with me from Missouri," she answered, marking her page with a piece of twine. Wyatt leaned against the doorframe. He crossed his arms over his chest. He wasn't mocking her, he was genuinely curious. "That's heavy reading for a cook. Most folks around here think a woman's reading should stop at the good book." Abby laid her pencil down. She folded her scarred hands together on top of the open pages. The flickering light cast deep shadows on her face, highlighting the strong, sharp lines of her jaw. She didn't look away. She didn't shrink under his questioning gaze. "Mr. Sterling," Abby said. Her voice was rhythmic, clear, ringing with a quiet, unshakable power. "Folks around here think a lot of things. They think a woman's only value is in her sewing, or her graceful walk, or her ability to keep her mouth shut when the men are talking." Wyatt stayed quiet, listening. Abby leaned forward slightly. "But intellect does not recognize gender. A mind is a mind. A woman has every right to use her knowledge to understand the world. She has the right to study the dirt she walks on. To use her intellect to stand on her own 2 feet, rather than waiting for society's handouts or bowing to its shallow judgments." She tapped the cover of the book. "I might not be able to carry a tray of dishes without tripping over my own feet, Mr. Sterling. But I know how to retain moisture in a dry alkali soil. And I know that the worth of a human being isn't defined by the limits other people put on them." Wyatt stood absolutely still. The words hit him hard. They weren't angry. They weren't a complaint. They were a declaration of independence, a pure, undeniable statement of equality. He looked at this woman, really looked at her. He saw past the stained apron. He saw past the clumsy hands and the graying hair. He saw a mind that was sharp, fierce, and entirely unbroken by the cruelty of the world. He slowly pushed himself off the doorframe. He walked over to the table. He didn't sit down, but he stood close enough to smell the faint scent of lavender soap on her skin. "Chapter 4, Wyatt said softly. Abby blinked, confused. "Excuse me?" "Chapter 4 of that book," Wyatt pointed to the pages. "It talks about deep-root alfalfa planting for drought seasons. I tried it 3 years ago. Failed miserably." A slow, genuine smile touched the corners of Abby's mouth. It was the first time he had seen her truly smile. It changed her whole face. "You failed," Abby said softly, "because you planted in late spring. The soil in Texas doesn't hold the winter moisture like it does in Missouri. You have to plant before the last frost." Wyatt stared at her. A heavy, warm feeling bloomed in his chest, a feeling that scared him entirely. "I'll remember that," he said. He picked up his lantern. He walked out the back door into the dark, leaving her at the table with her books and her fierce, beautiful mind. He walked out to the barn, looking up at the vast canopy of Texas stars. He had hired a cook because he was desperate. But as he stood in the dark, Wyatt Sterling realized he had found something else entirely. He just didn't have a name for it yet. The dust didn't settle. The wind out of the south kept it moving. Fine. Red powder that coated the windows and got into a man's teeth. Wyatt stood on the front porch. He was watching the road. 30 days had passed since Silas Vance gave him his ultimatum. 30 days of back-breaking harvest. 30 days of Abby burning edges and dropping spoons while quietly holding the whole crew together. But hard work doesn't stop a bank. A buggy rolled up the drive. It wasn't just Silas this time. 3 men climbed down. Silas looked miserable. The second man wore a sharp gray suit that had no business being in Dust Creek. The third man carried a leather briefcase. A lawyer. You could smell a lawyer from a mile away in Texas. Wyatt didn't walk out to meet them. He let them come to the steps. "Wyatt," Silas said. He took off his hat, a bad sign. "I didn't want to come out here today." "But you did," Wyatt said. His voice was flat. "Who are your friends?" The man in the gray suit stepped forward. He had slick hair, cold eyes. A man who dealt in paper, not dirt. "Harrison Caldwell, Fort Worth. And this is Mr. Davis, my attorney." "I don't know you, Mr. Caldwell, and I don't care to." "You don't need to know me, Mr. Sterling. You just need to know the law." Caldwell nodded to the lawyer. The lawyer opened his briefcase. He pulled out a thick, yellowed piece of parchment. It was encased in a protective leather folder. "This is a deed," Caldwell said, "dated 1849. It grants the eastern tract of this ranch, the exact tract you put up for collateral to Mr. Vance's bank, to my grandfather. The land was sold illegally to your father a year later. The sale was never properly recorded in the state ledger." Wyatt stared at him. The wind howled around the porch eaves. "That's a lie," Wyatt said quietly. "My father bought that land free and clear, paid in gold." "He might have paid," the lawyer chimed in, his voice nasal and practiced. "But he bought it from a man who had already forfeited the rights. The title is clouded, Mr. Sterling, which means your collateral with the bank is invalid." Wyatt looked at Silas. Silas looked down at his boots. "The bank examiners found the discrepancy, Wyatt. If the collateral is no good, the loan is called in immediately, unless you can prove otherwise. In court." Court. Court meant money. Court meant lawyers in Austin. Court meant time he didn't have. "You want the land," Wyatt said, looking back at Caldwell. "I want what belongs to my family," Caldwell said smoothly. "I'm willing to settle. Sign over the eastern tract today. Quitclaim deed. I'll pay off your $300 debt to Mr. Vance as a courtesy. You keep the house. I take the grass. Everyone walks away." It was a trap, a perfectly laid legal trap. The front screen door creaked open. Abby stepped out onto the porch. She carried a wooden tray, 4 tin cups, a pitcher of cold well water. "Gentlemen," she said. Her voice was steady. "It's a hot ride from town." Caldwell looked at her. He didn't say thank you. He just took a cup. Wyatt watched Abby. He watched her closely. When Caldwell spoke his name, when the lawyer mentioned the year 1849, she didn't flinch. She didn't drop the tray. She poured the water with a steady hand. Too steady. She poured Silas a cup. She looked right past Caldwell. Then she turned and went back inside. "Think about it, Mr. Sterling," Caldwell said, setting his empty cup on the railing. "We'll be staying at the boarding house in town. You have 3 days before we file the suit in Austin." They got back in the buggy. They drove away. Wyatt stood on the porch for a long time. The ice in the pitcher melted. The water grew warm. That night, the house was dead quiet. Wyatt couldn't sleep. The eastern tract was the lifeblood of the ranch. Without that grazing grass, the herd would starve before winter. If he fought them, the legal fees would bankrupt him. If he surrendered, he lost his father's legacy. He needed proof. He needed his father's old records. Wyatt threw off his blanket. He pulled on his boots and lit a kerosene lantern. He walked out the back door. The night was pitch black. No moon. He crossed the dirt yard to the old storage shed behind the barn. It was a dilapidated structure. The roof sagged. The door was held shut by a rusted padlock. Wyatt hadn't been inside since his father died. Nobody had. He kept the key on an iron ring in his pocket. He unlocked the padlock. It fought him, grinding with rust. He pulled the door open. The smell of dry rot, old leather, and dust hit him in the face. He raised the lantern. Shadows danced against walls lined with broken plows, rotted harnesses, and stacked wooden crates. He walked to the back. There was a heavy iron lockbox sitting on the top shelf. That was where the old man kept his papers. Wyatt reached up. His hand brushed against something soft. He stopped. He lowered the lantern. He looked at the shelf just behind a rusted tin of nails. There was a piece of cloth. Wyatt reached out slowly. He picked it up. It was a woman's handkerchief. White cotton, edged in fine lace. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, turning it gray. It had been sitting there for months, maybe longer. Wyatt brushed the dust away with his thumb. In the corner, stitched in delicate blue thread, were 2 letters. A T. Abigail Thornton. Wyatt stared at the letters. The lantern light flickered, casting long, jumping shadows across his hardened face. His mind raced. Abby had arrived at the ranch 2 months ago. She had never asked for the key to this shed. She had no reason to be in here. And yet this handkerchief had been sitting under months of undisturbed dust. She had been here before he hired her, before she dropped the plates in Martha's diner, before Caldwell showed up demanding land. Wyatt squeezed the handkerchief in his fist. His knuckles turned white. He didn't feel anger. Not yet. He felt cold. A deep, sinking cold that settled right in the center of his chest. She wasn't just a clumsy cook. She wasn't just a widow looking for work. She was a ghost, and she was hiding something in his house. The tension in the kitchen the next morning was thick enough to cut with a Bowie knife. Wyatt sat at the table. He drank his coffee. He watched Abby. He watched the way she moved. He watched the way her eyes darted to the window. He looked for the lie. He looked for the crack in her armor, but she just cooked. She burned a pan of biscuits. She apologized. She scrubbed the pan. She was exactly who she claimed to be, and yet he knew she wasn't. He kept the handkerchief in his pocket. A heavy cotton secret. He wouldn't confront her, not yet. He needed to know the shape of the trap before he stepped into it. "I'm riding into town," Wyatt said, standing up. "Need nails and flour." Abby nodded without turning around. "We need salt, too, if you please." Wyatt walked out. Dust Creek was sweltering. The midday sun beat down on the wooden boardwalks, baking the pine boards until they cracked. Wyatt tied his horse in front of the mercantile. He stepped up onto the boardwalk. Before he reached the door, he heard the voices. They were coming from the open window of Martha Higgins' diner, right next door. Women's voices, sharp, eager. The unmistakable sound of a small town devouring one of its own. "I'm just saying what everyone is thinking," Martha's voice rang out loud and clear over the clatter of silverware. "Living out there, miles from nowhere, just her and 3 grown men." "It ain't proper," another woman agreed. "A respectable widow would have gone to the church for help. She wouldn't have shacked up with the Sterling boys. Lord knows what goes on in that house after dark." "She couldn't hold a job here because she's useless," Martha sneered. "I reckon she found another way to pay for her keep out at that ranch. A woman like that has no shame, no value. Just a stray dog looking for a warm bed." Wyatt stopped. His hand was on the brass handle of the mercantile door. He froze. The anger he had been holding back since last night. The anger about the deed, about Caldwell, about the handkerchief in his pocket, suddenly boiled over. But it didn't boil over at Abby. It boiled over at the cruelty of the world. Wyatt let go of the door handle. He turned. He walked the 10 paces to the diner. He pushed the swinging doors open with such force they hit the interior walls with a loud crack. The diner went dead silent. Martha Higgins was standing behind the counter, a coffee pot in her hand. 3 local women were sitting at a table near the window. They stared at Wyatt, wide-eyed. Wyatt walked slowly into the center of the room. His boots echoed on the floorboards. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. The quiet menace in his posture was enough to suck the air out of the room. He looked directly at Martha. "Put the pot down, Martha," Wyatt said. His voice was a low rumble. Martha swallowed hard. She set the pot on the counter. "Wyatt, we were just having a private conversation." "There is no such thing as a private conversation when the windows are open and the malice is that loud," Wyatt said. He turned his gaze to the women at the table. They shrank back in their chairs. Wyatt stood tall. His chest heaved once. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a judge handing down a sentence. "Let me make something absolutely clear," Wyatt said, his words ringing out crisp and undeniable. "The right to live without being unjustly judged is a fundamental human right. It is the bedrock of a decent society." He stepped closer to the table. "You use your idle time and your prejudices to strip the dignity from a widow who works from before dawn until past dark. A woman who has no family here to defend her. You invent sins for her because you cannot stand the sight of someone surviving without your approval. That is not morality, ladies. That is violence. It is emotional violence, and it is cowardly." Martha crossed her arms, trying to salvage her pride. "We have a right to our opinions, Wyatt." Wyatt turned his cold eyes back to her. "You have a right to your thoughts. You do not have the right to destroy a human being's reputation for sport. Abigail Thornton has more grace in her burnt fingertips than this entire room has in its collective soul. If I hear one more word against her character, you won't be dealing with a clumsy cook. You'll be dealing with me." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked out. The silence he left behind was absolute. Wyatt bought his supplies. He loaded his saddlebags. His blood was still running hot. He had defended her. He had spoken the truth. But the truth didn't change the handkerchief in his pocket. He mounted his horse. He didn't ride back to the ranch. He turned his horse south, toward Austin. It was a punishing ride. 2 days through the scrub brush and relentless heat. He slept on the hard ground. He needed answers. He needed a real property lawyer to look into Caldwell's 1849 deed. Austin was loud, crowded, full of politicians, cattle barons, and hustlers. Wyatt found the law office on Congress Avenue. The lawyer, a tired-looking man named Henderson, took a copy of the deed Caldwell had left with Wyatt. "I'll need to check the state archives," Henderson said, adjusting his spectacles. "It'll take a few hours. Wait at the bank down the street. It's cooler there." Wyatt walked down to the First National Bank of Texas. The building was made of limestone and polished marble. It smelled like money. He walked up to a teller cage to check the balance of his own dwindling account. He needed to know how much rope he had left before Silas Vance pulled the floor out from under him. The teller was a young man with a slick mustache. He took Wyatt's name and went to the back ledgers. When he returned, the teller looked over his wire-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Sterling from Dust Creek," the teller said casually, copying a number onto a slip of paper. "How is the weather up that way? I haven't seen Mrs. Thornton in a few months. Assume she's still residing up there?" Wyatt went perfectly still. The marble walls seemed to close in. "You know Abigail Thornton?" Wyatt asked. He kept his voice completely level. "Oh, yes, sir," the teller smiled. "She transferred her accounts here from St. Louis about 4 months ago. Fine lady. Very particular about her investments. I handle her drafts personally." Wyatt stared at the brass bars of the teller cage. "Her accounts?" The teller chuckled, a polite, professional sound. "Well, I shouldn't discuss a client's specific numbers, naturally. But yes, the life insurance policy her late husband left her, plus the sale of his shipping business in Missouri. It's a very substantial trust. She's one of our more comfortable depositors." The teller slid the slip of paper under the brass grating. Wyatt's own balance, $312. Abigail Thornton was rich. She wasn't a desperate widow looking for a warm bed. She wasn't a poor cook who needed to endure Jesse's insults or Martha's cruelty for a few dollars a week. She had enough money sitting in this marble building to buy his ranch 10 times over. Wyatt took his slip of paper. He didn't say goodbye. He walked out of the bank. The Austin sun hit him like a physical blow. He stood on the crowded sidewalk. Wagons rattled past. People pushed by him. He didn't feel them. The pieces were snapping together. A wealthy widow from Missouri, a handkerchief hidden in a shed from decades ago, a man from Fort Worth showing up with a deed from 1849. She didn't need the job. She had endured the mockery, the burns, the grueling labor, all for a reason. She was planted there. Wyatt walked back to his horse. His chest felt hollow. He had defended her honor in front of the whole town. He had looked at her in the dim light of the kitchen and seen a woman of pure, unshakable integrity. He had started to feel things he had sworn never to feel again. And it was all a lie. Wyatt swung up into the saddle. He turned his horse north, back toward Dust Creek, back toward the ranch. The ride home was going to be a long, dark road, and at the end of it, a reckoning was waiting. The heat broke on a Tuesday. It didn't fade. It shattered. The sky over Dust Creek turned a bruised, ugly green. The wind died completely. The air grew so heavy you had to chew it just to breathe. Wyatt stood in the dirt yard. He looked west. A wall of black clouds was rolling over the canyon rim. Lightning flashed deep inside the bruised sky. No thunder yet, just the silent, flashing warning of a Texas squall. "Tie everything down," Wyatt yelled. Jesse and the two hands scrambled. They tied down the wagon tarps. They barred the heavy wooden shutters on the main house. The wind hit them first. It didn't start as a breeze. It hit like a runaway train. Dust scoured Wyatt's face. It blinded him. Then came the rain. Cold, hard, driving in sideways like buckshot. Wyatt ran for the barn. The herd was already inside, packed tight. 36 head of cattle. The nervous lowing of the animals echoed over the rising wind. Wyatt pushed the heavy barn doors shut. Jesse helped him drop the thick iron bar into place. They stood in the dim light. The smell of wet hay, manure, and fear was thick. The wind grabbed the barn. It shook the massive timbers. Above them, a loud, sharp crack echoed. Wyatt looked up. The main crossbeam of the roof was groaning. The wood splintered. Dust rained down on them. "The roof is going!" Jesse shouted. Another crack, louder this time. The back section of the barn roof ripped away. It peeled back like a tin can. The storm poured inside. Black rain and howling wind filled the barn. The cattle panicked. 30 steers surged forward, a wall of muscle and horns. They slammed into the wooden stalls. Wood splintered. A young calf went down in the mud. The herd was going to trample themselves to death in the panic. "Get them out," Wyatt roared. "Open the back pens. Push them out into the open pasture." Cattle were safer in the open storm than in a collapsing box. Wyatt waded into the herd. He swung his rope. He yelled. The animals wouldn't move. They were blind with terror. Jesse was pushed back against a wall, nearly crushed by a massive brindled steer. It was chaos. Black, wet, screaming chaos. Then a light appeared. It cut through the rain and the dark. A yellow, flickering glow. Wyatt turned. It was Abby. She was standing at the edge of the open pen. She held a kerosene lantern high in her right hand. Her dress was soaked, clinging to her. Her hair was plastered to her face. She was slipping in the mud, stumbling over the uneven ground. But she held the light high. "Sha!" she screamed. Her voice cut through the wind. "Sha! Get on out!" She waved her apron with her free hand. She slipped to her knees. The mud coated her. She didn't drop the lantern. She scrambled back up. She stood her ground as 1,000 pounds of panicked beef rushed toward her. The led steer saw the light. It saw the open gate. It bolted past her into the storm. The rest of the herd followed, a stampede of hooves splashing in the deep mud. Abby stood by the gate. The lantern shook in her hands. She counted them out. She didn't retreat. When the last calf cleared the gate, Wyatt ran to her. He grabbed her arm. He pulled her away from the collapsing structure. They ran for the main house. The wind pushed them. The rain blinded them. They made it to the back porch and stumbled into the kitchen. Wyatt slammed the heavy oak door shut. He locked it. The sudden quiet of the house was jarring. The storm still raged outside, but inside it was just the sound of heavy breathing. Jesse and the hands had made it to the bunkhouse. It was just Wyatt and Abby. Wyatt stood in the middle of the kitchen. Water pooled at his boots. His muscles trembled. He was cold, a deep, bone-aching cold. He looked at Abby. She was covered in black mud. Her knuckles were bleeding from where she had scraped them on the gate. She looked ruined. She set the lantern on the table. She didn't say a word. She just went to the stove. She started feeding kindling into the dying embers. Wyatt walked over to a heavy wooden chair. He sat down. He put his elbows on his knees. He buried his face in his hands. It was 4 in the morning. The adrenaline was gone. And in its place, the weight of the world crashed down on him. The barn was gone. That was hundreds of dollars in timber. The bank wanted the Eastern Tract. Caldwell had a deed from 1849. The woman standing at the stove making coffee was a wealthy widow holding a secret. He had fought so hard for 6 years. He had pushed everyone away. He had built walls. He had survived. But a man can only survive so much. Wyatt let out a breath. It was a ragged, broken sound. His shoulders shook. He didn't sob, but he couldn't stop the trembling. The rigid, immovable cowboy was finally breaking apart. He heard the scrape of a chair. Abby sat down next to him. She didn't offer a towel. She didn't pat his shoulder. She didn't offer empty comforts. She just sat there, wet, bruised, present. She poured a hot cup of black coffee. She slid it across the table until it touched his knuckles. Wyatt slowly raised his head. His eyes were red. He looked at her. He didn't try to hide his face. He didn't have the strength to rebuild his pride tonight. "I'm losing it," Wyatt whispered. His voice was hoarse. "I'm losing the land. I'm losing the herd. I can't hold it together anymore." Abby looked at him. The firelight flickered in her eyes. She didn't tell him it would be all right. She didn't tell him he was strong. She leaned forward. Her voice was steady. It anchored the room. "Listen to me, Wyatt," Abby said. Her words were slow, carrying the absolute weight of lived truth. Suffering doesn't care if you're the boss or the hired help. It doesn't care if you own 1,000 acres or if you scrub pots for a living. In the middle of a storm, no one is better than anyone else. We all get wet. We all freeze. Wyatt stared at her. The words pierced right through his exhaustion. "You think you have to carry it all because you're the man of this house," Abby continued. "You think showing a wound makes you weak, but it doesn't. Human compassion is the only thing that keeps us from drowning. You have to let people help you. I am not here for your wages. I am here because we are both just people, and right now we are both just trying to hold up the roof." Wyatt looked at her scarred, muddy hands resting on the table. He had spent 6 years making sure nobody saw him bleed. And here was this woman, sitting in the wreckage of his life, telling him it was okay to be broken. Wyatt reached out. His large, calloused hand covered hers. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. For the first time since his wife died, Wyatt Sterling wasn't alone in the dark. He closed his eyes. The storm raged outside, but inside the kitchen, the silence was finally at peace. The morning sun felt like an insult. It rose bright and yellow over Dust Creek, glittering off the massive puddles of muddy water left by the storm. Wyatt stood in the yard. The barn roof was completely gone. The timbers were shattered like matchsticks. The herd was scattered across 3 miles of wet pasture. It was a mess. But he felt different. The crushing weight from the night before had shifted. It hadn't disappeared, but it was bearable. Because he wasn't carrying it alone. He walked back toward the house to get his heavy work gloves. Inside the kitchen, Jesse was rummaging through a wooden cabinet near the stove. He was looking for dry rags to wipe down the saddles. In his haste, Jesse knocked over a small leather satchel sitting on the counter. It belonged to Abby. The buckle popped open. A few spools of thread rolled across the floor, and a thick white envelope slid out, landing face up on the pine boards. "Damn it," Jesse muttered. He knelt down to pick up the mess. He grabbed the envelope. He froze. He recognized the name on the return address. Everyone in the house knew that name now. It was the name that brought the lawyer to the front porch. Jessie stood up just as Wyatt walked through the back door. "Wyatt," Jessie said. His voice was tight, nervous. "You need to look at this." Wyatt stopped. He looked at his brother. He looked at the envelope in Jessie's hand. "Put her things back, Jessie. It's not our business." "It is our business," Jessie insisted. He stepped forward and shoved the envelope into Wyatt's chest. "Read the name." Wyatt looked down. The handwriting was elegant, sharp. "Mr. Harrison Caldwell, Fort Worth, Texas, addressed to Mrs. Abigail Thornton." The air in the kitchen went perfectly still. The warmth Wyatt had felt in his chest just an hour ago turned to ice. He remembered the bank teller in Austin. She transferred her accounts here from St. Louis, a very substantial trust. He remembered the handkerchief in the shed. Wyatt didn't want to open it. He knew that opening it would destroy the fragile peace of the night before. But a man protecting his home doesn't have the luxury of ignoring a loaded gun. Wyatt pulled the letter from the envelope. He unfolded the heavy paper. He read the words. "My dear Abigail, I have located the original 1849 deed. The Sterling claim is invalid. The land your grandfather was forced to abandon is rightfully ours to reclaim. We can work together to oust the Sterling claim and restore your ancestral rights. Write me when you are in position. Yours, Harrison Caldwell." Wyatt read it twice. He didn't read the date on the letter. He didn't notice that it was postmarked 3 months ago, long before Caldwell ever showed up in Dust Creek. He didn't notice that it was an offer, not an agreement. He only saw the betrayal. She had lied to him. She was rich. She was tied to Caldwell. She was here to take his land. Every burnt biscuit, every dropped plate, every quiet moment on the porch, every word of comfort she had spoken to him in the dark just 4 hours ago, it was all a strategy, a way to get inside his house, to get inside his head. The back door creaked open. Abby walked in. She carried a basket of wet clothes she had retrieved from the mud. She looked exhausted. But when she saw Wyatt and Jessie standing there, she stopped. She saw the letter in Wyatt's hand. She didn't gasp. She didn't drop the basket. She just set it down slowly on the table. Jessie backed away, leaning against the far wall. Wyatt walked toward the table. His face was a mask of cold, hard stone. He placed the letter on the wood. He smoothed it out with his thumb. "You want to tell me about this?" Wyatt asked. His voice was dead, stripped of all emotion. Abby looked at the letter. She looked at Wyatt's eyes. She saw the walls were back up, thicker than ever. "I can explain that," Abby said. Her voice was calm. "Can you?" Wyatt snapped. The anger finally broke through. "Can you explain how a wealthy widow from Missouri ends up scrubbing pots in Texas? Can you explain why you hid your grandfather's handkerchief in my shed? Can you explain why you let my brother insult you? Why you let the whole town laugh at you, just so you could sleep under my roof while Caldwell prepares to steal my land?" Abby flinched. The words hit her like physical blows. But her spine straightened. "I am not conspiring with Caldwell," Abby said. "He wrote me that letter before I ever came here. I didn't answer it. I didn't agree to his plan." "Then why are you here?" Wyatt yelled. He slammed his fist on the table. The coffee cups rattled. "Why play the fool? Why play the clumsy, helpless cook? Was it amusing to you? Watching me struggle to keep this place alive while you sat on a fortune in Austin?" Abby's eyes flashed. She didn't back down. She stepped closer to the table, closing the distance between them. "I did not play the fool," Abby said. Her voice rose, ringing with a fierce, absolute clarity. "I am clumsy, that is the truth. But the rest of it? I am here because this dirt belonged to my grandfather, Patrick Thornton. He didn't abandon it. He loved it. I came here because my husband died, and I had nowhere left in the world that felt like mine." Wyatt stared at her, breathing hard. Abby wasn't finished. She looked right into his angry eyes. She was going to make him hear her. "I took this job to see the land," Abby declared, "to know my roots. But you listen to me, Wyatt Sterling. You have the right to be angry that I didn't tell you my name sooner. But you do not have the right to trample on my sincerity. You do not have the right to accuse me of mocking your struggle." She gestured toward the door. "A person's right to seek out their heritage, to find their own peace, does not make them a villain. I worked until my hands bled for you. I stood in the storm for you. I offered you my compassion when you were broken. You are letting your own insecurities and your fear of trusting someone turn you into a cruel man. That is your failing, Wyatt, not mine." The kitchen fell silent. The words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. Wyatt's jaw flexed. He wanted to believe her. Deep down, the man he had been at 4 in the morning desperately wanted to believe her. But 6 years of isolation is a hard habit to break. The fear of being made a fool was stronger than his faith in her. "Get your things," Wyatt said. He turned his back to her. He couldn't look at her face. "Jesse will drive you into town." Abby looked at his broad back. She saw the rigid set of his shoulders. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. A woman of her dignity didn't beg a man to see the truth when he willfully chose the dark. "I'll walk," Abby said softly. She turned. She walked down the hallway. 10 minutes later, she walked out the front door. She didn't carry much, just a small leather bag. Wyatt stood at the kitchen window. He watched her walk down the long dirt drive, a solitary figure moving away from the ranch. The sky was blue. The storm was over. But as Wyatt watched her disappear over the ridge, he realized that the house hadn't felt this empty, this cold, since the day his wife died. He had protected his pride. He had protected his ranch. But he knew, with a sickening certainty in the pit of his stomach, that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The house was dead, not quiet. Dead. Quiet is peaceful. Quiet is the sound of a fire burning low. Quiet is the sound of a woman reading a book at the kitchen table. This was an absence, a hollow, ringing emptiness. Wyatt sat in the kitchen. He didn't make coffee. He didn't start the stove. He just looked at the wooden floorboards. There was a faint stain near the counter, a dark spot where Abby had spilled the beef stew. He stared at it for a long time. He had won. He had protected his house. He had thrown out the spy. So why did it feel like he had just burned his own life to the ground? Wyatt stood up. He grabbed his hat. He walked out the front door and saddled his horse. He didn't tell Jesse where he was going. He didn't know himself. He just knew he couldn't sit in that kitchen for one more minute. He rode into Dust Creek. The mud from the storm was already baking into hard, cracked clay. The town was waking up. People moved along the boardwalks. Wyatt ignored them. He tied his horse outside the small, white clapboard church at the end of the street. Reverend Josiah Miller was sitting on the front steps. He was an old man. His skin was like tanned leather. His eyes had seen every birth, every death, and every lie this town had ever produced. Josiah was whittling a piece of soft pine. He didn't look up when Wyatt's boots crunched on the gravel. "Morning, Wyatt." "Reverend." Wyatt took off his hat. He stood at the bottom of the wooden steps. He didn't know how to start. He was a man of action, not a man of words. Josiah blew the wood shavings off his knife. "You look like a man dragging a heavy chain." Wyatt swallowed hard. "I need to ask you about the past, about my father, and a man named Patrick Thornton." Josiah stopped whittling. He closed his pocket knife with a sharp click. He looked up at Wyatt. The old man's eyes were sharp, piercing. "I wondered when the ghosts were going to finally wake up," Josiah said softly. "Sit down, son." Wyatt sat on the wooden step. He stared out at the dusty street. "A man named Caldwell came to my ranch," Wyatt said. "He brought a deed from 1849, said my father stole the eastern tract from Patrick Thornton, said the title is clouded. Now the bank is calling in my loan." Josiah nodded slowly. "I know about Harrison Caldwell. He's a vulture. He looks for old paper and weak men. He found the paper, but he misjudged the man." "Is it true?" Wyatt asked. His voice was tight. "Did my father steal that land?" Josiah sighed. It was a heavy sound, the sound of a man carrying too many secrets. "No," Josiah said. Your father was a hard man, but he was an honest one. He didn't steal the dirt. Wyatt felt a small knot loosen in his chest. Then why the deed? Why does Caldwell think he has a claim? Because Patrick Thornton didn't sell the land for profit, Josiah explained. He sold it for survival. It was a bad winter, 1849. The crops died. The cattle froze. Patrick took a loan from your father, a large one, to keep his family from starving. Wyatt listened. The wind rattled the church windows. Patrick couldn't pay it back, Josiah continued. He was a proud man, like you. He didn't want charity, so he signed over the Eastern Tract to settle the debt. It was a fair trade, but it broke his heart. He packed up his family and moved north to Missouri. He died a few years later. The paperwork, well, it was the frontier. Things weren't filed in Austin the way they are now. But the trade was honest. Wyatt looked down at his hands. He thought about Abby. He thought about the letter from Caldwell. Abigail Thornton, Wyatt said softly. She's Patrick's granddaughter. I know, Josiah said. Wyatt turned his head. You knew? And you didn't tell me? It wasn't my story to tell, Josiah said simply. She came to me when she first arrived in town. She asked where the Thornton land was. I pointed her to your ridge. Caldwell wrote her, Wyatt said. His voice was rising now, the anger returning. He asked her to join him, to take the land back. And did she? Josiah asked. His voice was perfectly calm. Wyatt stopped. He thought about the letter. He thought about Abby's face when he threw her out. He wrote me that letter before I ever came here. I didn't answer it. No, Wyatt whispered. I don't think she did. Then why did you throw her out? Wyatt stood up. He paced a tight circle in the dirt. Because she lied to me. She hid who she was. She pretended to be a poor cook. She let the whole town laugh at her. She hid her grandfather's handkerchief in my shed. She had money. She didn't need the job. She was playing a game. Josiah watched him. He let Wyatt vent. He let the anger burn itself out. When Wyatt finally stopped pacing, Josiah stood up. He walked down the steps. He stood face to face with the younger man. Wyatt, Josiah said. His voice was stern. It was the voice he used behind the pulpit. You are looking at this through the eyes of a man who expects to be betrayed. You are letting your fear blind you to the truth. Wyatt clenched his jaw. What truth? Josiah placed a weathered hand on Wyatt's shoulder. He looked him dead in the eye. True healing, Josiah said, his words ringing loud and clear in the quiet morning air, only begins when you have the courage to face the truth, even if it costs you everything. Justice isn't about fighting to win, Wyatt. Justice is respecting the rightful claims of others, even when that person is the very one the whole world is laughing at. You judged that woman based on your own broken pride. She didn't come to steal your land. She came to find her roots, and you punished her for it. The words hit Wyatt like a physical blow. He stepped back. He had demanded respect for her from his brother. He had demanded respect for her from Martha Higgins. But when it came down to it, when the pressure was on, he had refused to give her that same respect himself. He had assumed the worst, because assuming the worst was safe. I have to fix this, Wyatt said. His voice was hollow. How? Josiah asked. Wyatt turned and looked toward his horse. He knew exactly what he had to do, and it was going to cost him. He rode straight back to the ranch. He didn't stop. He pushed the horse hard. When he got to the house, he went straight to the old shed. He unlocked the padlock. He reached up to the top shelf and pulled down his father's heavy iron lockbox. He carried it to the kitchen table. He broke the lock with a hammer. Inside were stacks of old paper, receipts, letters, bills of sale. Wyatt dug through them. His hands were shaking. He pulled out the oldest documents at the bottom, yellowed, brittle. He found it. A handwritten ledger from 1849. It detailed the loan given to Patrick Thornton. It detailed the transfer of the deed to settle the debt. It was signed by both men. It was the only proof that the land was taken fairly. Wyatt looked at the paper. If he took this to court, he would win. He would defeat Caldwell. He would keep his land. But it would mean fighting Abby's family claim in public. It would mean dragging her grandfather's desperation into a courtroom. It would mean fighting a war he was tired of fighting. Wyatt folded the papers. He walked into his study. He sat at his desk. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and dipped a pen in black ink. He didn't write to a lawyer to build a defense. He wrote to Harrison Caldwell, and he wrote to Abby's lawyer in Austin. He placed the original 1849 documents inside a thick leather envelope. He enclosed his letter. He wrote that he was surrendering the documents. He was offering absolute transparency. He would not fight the claim in court. If Caldwell and Abby wanted the land, they could review the original trade. If they deemed it unjust, Wyatt would hand over the Eastern Tract freely. He was putting his entire ranch, his father's legacy, into their hands. He was choosing the truth over his property. Wyatt sealed the envelope with hot wax. He stamped it. He called for Jesse. "Take this to the postmaster in town," Wyatt said, handing his brother the heavy package. "Tell him it goes on the noon stage to Austin, certified." Jesse looked at the package. He looked at Wyatt's face. The hard, angry lines were gone. Wyatt just looked tired. "What is it?" Jesse asked. "It's the Eastern Tract," Wyatt said quietly. "Take it." Jesse didn't argue. He took the envelope and ran for the barn. Wyatt walked out onto the front porch. He leaned against the wooden railing. He looked out over the vast rolling plains of Texas. He might lose the grass. He might lose the herd. But for the first time in 6 years, his conscience was completely clear. Abby sat on the edge of a narrow bed. The room at the Dust Creek boarding house was small, hot. It smelled like lye soap and old dust. Her leather bag was packed, sitting by the door. The noon stagecoach was leaving in 2 hours. She was going back to Missouri, back to the large, empty house in St. Louis, back to the banks and the trust funds and the deafening silence of a life she didn't want. She looked down at her hands. The cuts from the broken plates were healing. The burns from the cast-iron stove were turning to pale pink scars. She traced one of the burns with her thumb. She didn't regret the burns. She didn't regret the work. She thought about her late husband, Thomas. He had been a good man, a kind man. He had built a shipping empire on the Mississippi River. When he died, he left her everything: money, properties, status. But he hadn't left her an anchor. When Thomas died, Abby realized she belonged nowhere. She had no children, no siblings. Her parents were gone. She was floating through high society, a ghost in silk dresses. Then she found the old letters. Letters her grandfather Patrick had written to her mother. He wrote about Texas. He wrote about the red dirt. He wrote about the rolling hills of the Eastern Tract. He wrote about it with such desperate, agonizing love. Abby had come to Texas because she wanted to stand on that dirt. She wanted to feel the ground her family had bled for. She wanted, just for a moment, to feel tied to the earth. When she saw the advertisement for a cook at the Sterling Ranch, it was a sudden, crazy impulse. She couldn't cook without breaking things, she knew that. But it was a way to be on the land, a way to walk the hills without being an invader. And then she met him, Wyatt Sterling, a man as hard and broken as the land itself. She hadn't planned on caring for him. She hadn't planned on sitting in the dark with him, listening to the storm, feeling the terrifying rush of wanting to heal a man who refused to be healed. But he had looked at her like she was a thief. A heavy knock sounded at the door. Abby jumped. She smoothed her skirt and walked over. She opened the door. It was Mr. Higgins, the postmaster, Martha's husband. He looked uncomfortable standing there. "Telegram for you, Mrs. Thornton," he muttered. He handed her a folded yellow paper. "Came through the wire from your lawyer in Austin." Abby took the paper. "Thank you." She closed the door. She unfolded the telegram. "Abigail received documents from Wyatt Sterling today. He surrendered original 1849 ledgers. He refuses to fight in court, offers full transparency of sale, willing to forfeit land if deemed unjust by you, awaiting instructions. Abby stared at the yellow paper. She read it again, and again. Wyatt hadn't hired a lawyer. He hadn't built a wall. He hadn't fought back with anger and pride. He had surrendered his only defense. He had given her the weapon to destroy him, and he had stepped back. He had chosen the truth. Abby looked at her packed leather bag. She looked at the telegram. She walked over to the bag. She picked it up. She opened the latch and dumped the contents onto the narrow bed. Dresses, brushes, and shoes tumbled out. She wasn't getting on the stagecoach. The midday sun was brutal. Wyatt was standing in the ruins of the barn. His shirt was off. His back was slick with sweat. He was swinging a heavy sledgehammer, driving broken support beams out of the hard earth. Whack! The wood splintered. Whack! The earth shook. He was punishing himself. He wanted the physical pain to drown out the noise in his head. Jesse and the hands were out gathering the scattered herd. Wyatt was alone. He swung the hammer high over his head. He brought it down with a vicious grunt. "You're going to break the handle if you hit it off center like that." Wyatt froze. The hammerhead rested in the dirt. He kept his hands gripping the wooden shaft. His chest heaved. He slowly turned his head. Abby was standing at the edge of the ruined barn. She was wearing her traveling dress, dark green cotton, no apron. Her hair was pinned up perfectly. She didn't look like a clumsy cook. She looked like a woman of means. A woman who owned her own life. Wyatt slowly stood up straight. He dropped the sledgehammer. It hit the dirt with a dull thud. He grabbed a rag from a nearby post and wiped the sweat and dirt from his face. He didn't know what to say. He had expected the sheriff. He had expected a lawyer. He hadn't expected her. Abby walked forward. She stepped over the shattered timber. She stopped 10 feet away from him. "I got a wire from Austin," Abby said. Her voice was steady, calm. "My lawyer received your package." Wyatt tossed the rag aside. "Then you know the truth. My father didn't steal it. Your grandfather made a hard choice to save his family. But the paper is yours now. You and Caldwell can decide what to do with it." "Caldwell is a fraud," Abby said sharply. "He's a distant cousin looking for a payday. I fired my lawyer this morning. I sent a wire telling them to drop the claim. I don't want the land, Wyatt. I never wanted to take it from you." Wyatt stared at her. The wind blew a stray lock of red hair across her cheek. "Then why didn't you tell me who you were?" Wyatt asked softly. "Because I was scared," Abby admitted. She didn't look away. "I was scared that if you knew I had money, you'd look at me the way everyone else did in Missouri, like a bank account. I wanted to be here. I wanted to stand on this dirt. And when I broke those plates in the diner, and you stood up for me, you were the first person in my life who looked at me and saw a human being instead of a widow with a trust fund." She took a step closer. "But you threw it away, Wyatt, because you were more afraid of trusting me than you were of losing your ranch." Wyatt swallowed. His throat felt like sandpaper. He looked at this woman. He saw the strength in her spine. He saw the intelligence in her eyes. He saw the scars on her hands. He had been a fool. A proud, stupid, terrified fool. Wyatt stepped over the broken beams. He closed the distance between them. He stopped right in front of her. He was covered in sweat and dirt. She was pristine. He didn't reach out to touch her. He didn't have the right. Not yet. Wyatt took a deep breath. He looked straight into her eyes. He didn't hide behind his stoic mask. He let the walls crash down completely. "I am sorry, Abby," Wyatt said. His voice was deep. It trembled slightly with the weight of the words. He stood tall, making sure she heard every syllable. "Not just because I doubted you. I am sorry because I let my fear as a man cloud the respect I owe you. I let my pride tell me that you were a threat instead of seeing the truth." He paused, gathering his breath. The Texas wind seemed to stop and listen. "You are an independent, free woman. You have the right to seek out your history. You have the right to stand on this land. You stand as my equal, Abby, in every way. I judged you when I had no right to. I was a coward." Abby's eyes widened slightly. She searched his face. She was looking for the lie. She was looking for the proud cowboy trying to save his skin. But all she saw was a man standing in the ruins of his barn, offering her his absolute, unfiltered truth. "Thank you," Wyatt finished, his voice dropping to a raw whisper. "Thank you for teaching me how to be human again, even if I learned it too late." Abby stood in silence. The sun beat down on them. She looked at his broad, scarred chest. She looked at his tired, honest eyes. She slowly reached out. Her hand, the hand that burned the biscuits, the hand that dropped the plates, the hand that held the lantern in the storm, pressed flat against the center of his chest. Right over his heart, she could feel it beating, strong, fast. "It's not too late," Abby said softly. Wyatt let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for 6 years. He raised his own large, rough hand. He placed it gently over hers. He didn't pull her into a desperate embrace. He didn't kiss her. He just stood there in the wreckage, holding the hand of the clumsy cook who had finally brought him home. The bank in Dust Creek was stifling. The air was heavy. It smelled of ink, old paper, and stale sweat. Silas Vance sat behind his heavy oak desk. He looked nervous. He kept wiping his brow with a cotton handkerchief. Wyatt sat in a hard wooden chair. Abby sat next to him. Their shoulders didn't touch, but the space between them felt entirely different now. It wasn't a wall. It was a bridge. Across from them sat Harrison Caldwell. His slick gray suit looked rumpled. The Fort Worth lawyer sat beside him, looking pale. In the center of the desk sat the 1849 ledger. Open, exposed, undeniable. Caldwell stared at the brittle, yellowed pages. He looked at the faded ink. He looked at the signatures of Patrick Thornton and Elias Sterling. Caldwell had come to Dust Creek expecting a fight. He expected Wyatt to hide the deed. He expected lawyers, injunctions, and a long, dirty war in the courts. A war Caldwell was funded to win. He didn't expect a man to hand over the loaded gun and bare his chest. "The ledger is authentic," the lawyer finally muttered. He closed his briefcase with a soft snap. "The land was traded to settle a debt, fairly and legally. The title is clear, Mr. Caldwell. We have no claim." Caldwell's jaw tightened. He looked at Abby. He expected her to argue, to fight for her so-called birthright. Abby didn't say a word. She just looked at him. Her eyes were calm, unbothered. Caldwell stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He didn't apologize. Men like him never did. They just moved on to the next grift. He turned on his heel and walked out of the bank, the lawyer trailing behind him like a whipped dog. The heavy glass door swung shut. Silas Vance let out a long, ragged breath. He slumped back in his leather chair. "Well," Silas breathed, "I'll be damned." Wyatt didn't smile. He reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and slid it across the desk to Silas. "That's the deed to the north pasture," Wyatt said. His voice was flat. "Business. It's good grazing land. 30 acres. Sell it. Take your $340 out of the sale. Keep the change for your daughter's medicine. The bank's lien on my eastern tract is finished." Silas looked at the paper. His hand shook a little as he took it. "Wyatt, you don't have to overpay." "I pay my debts, Silas, and I pay for my peace. We're done." So Wyatt stood up. He put his hat on. He looked down at Abby. She stood up beside him. They walked out of the bank together. The midday sun was blinding. The main street of Dust Creek was busy. Wagons rolled past. Horses tied to hitching posts flicked their tails at the flies. People were watching. They saw Wyatt Sterling, the hardest, coldest man in the county, walking out of the bank, and they saw who was walking beside him. Abigail Thornton. She wasn't wearing a stained apron. Her face wasn't smeared with flour. But she was still the clumsy cook. She was still the woman who broke Martha Higgins's plates. Martha was standing on the boardwalk outside her diner. She was holding a broom. 2 other women stood beside her. They were whispering, pointing. Wyatt saw them. He saw the sneers. He heard the low, mocking laughter that still echoed from the day he hired Abby. He stopped in the middle of the dirt street. He didn't pull Abby into an alley. He didn't try to hide her from the town. He didn't look down. Wyatt turned to Abby. He took off his hat. He dropped it in the dirt. Then he reached out. He took both of her hands in his. Her hands were scarred, burned from hot iron skillets, cut from broken porcelain, rough from drawing well water. Wyatt held them gently. The street went quiet. The whispering stopped. Martha Higgins lowered her broom. Wyatt turned his head. He looked directly at Martha. Then he looked at the men standing by the mercantile. He looked at every person who had ever made a joke at this woman's expense. He took a deep breath. His voice boomed across the dusty square. It wasn't angry. It was absolute. "You all had a good laugh," Wyatt called out. His words rang against the wooden storefronts. "You laughed at her over some broken plates. You mocked her because she spilled some coffee. You thought that made her worthless." Martha shifted uncomfortably. A few men looked down at their boots. Wyatt squeezed Abby's hands. He kept his eyes on the crowd. He wasn't just talking to them. He was teaching them. "Let me tell you the truth about value," Wyatt declared, his voice ringing with pure conviction. "A woman's true worth does not lie in how gracefully she walks across a room. It doesn't lie in whether she drops a piece of porcelain. Her worth lies in the greatness of her soul. It lies in her character. These clumsy hands that you all laughed at? They held a lantern in a black storm to save my herd. They worked until they bled to feed my family. They healed a broken man and saved a dying ranch. True value is found in a person's compassion and their resilience, not in the shallow, petty judgments of a crowd." The silence in Dust Creek was absolute. You could hear the wind whistling through the telegraph wires. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. Wyatt turned his back on the town. He looked down at Abby. Her eyes were shining. A single tear tracked through the dust on her cheek. "Abby," Wyatt said softly, though the town could still hear him. "I'm a hard man. I'm stubborn. My house is drafty, and I don't know how to talk about my feelings worth a damn. But I know that my house was a grave before you walked into it, and I know I don't want to live another day without you." He looked down at her scarred hands. He kissed the knuckles of her right hand. "I want to marry the clumsiest cook in Texas," Wyatt said. "Will you have me?" Abby let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She didn't care about the people watching. She didn't care about the dust or the heat. She looked at this cowboy, this man who had just stripped away every defense he had, right in the middle of the street, just to honor her. "Yes," Abby said. Her voice was strong. "Yes, Wyatt, I will." Wyatt pulled her in. He kissed her. Not a polite, formal kiss, a real one. When they pulled apart, the street was still quiet. Martha Higgins turned around and walked back into her diner. She didn't say a word. The spell of cruelty was broken. The laughter was dead. They didn't have a big wedding. Neither of them wanted one. A week later, they stood inside the small, white clapboard church at the end of town. The late afternoon sun streamed through the plain glass windows, painting the pine pews in gold. It was just Wyatt and Abby. Jesse stood as the best man, looking uncomfortable but proud in a borrowed suit. Dutch and Silas, the ranch hands, sat in the front row holding their hats in their laps. Reverend Josiah Miller stood behind the wooden pulpit. He spoke the ancient words. They exchanged plain gold bands. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Josiah said, a warm smile wrinkling his weathered face. Wyatt kissed his bride. It felt easy. It felt right. Before they turned to walk down the aisle, Josiah raised a hand. "Hold on a minute," the old reverend said. He reached into the inside pocket of his black coat. He pulled out a small, flat envelope. The paper was ancient, brown, brittle at the edges. He held it out to Wyatt and Abby. "I found this in the church archives a few days ago," Josiah said quietly. tucked inside an old registry book from 1849. I think it belongs to both of you. Wyatt took the envelope. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was elegant, sweeping, and faded to a pale brown. Abby leaned in close. She recognized the handwriting immediately from her mother's old letters. "It's from my grandfather," Abby whispered. Wyatt read the words out loud. His voice was low, carrying through the empty church. "To Elias Sterling, the trade is done, the land is yours. It is good dirt. It will feed a man who knows how to be patient with it. I hold no malice toward you, Elias. You saved my family from winter's bite. I leave this place with a heavy heart, but a clear conscience. I only pray that you treat the land well. And should the day ever come when the blood of my family returns to this valley, I pray that the blood of your family will welcome them, not as strangers, but as neighbors. Patrick Thornton." Wyatt stopped reading. He stared at the brittle paper. The words stretched across 30 years, across death, across pain, across a storm of misunderstanding. The land had a memory. 2 grandfathers had stood on that dirt and made a hard choice. And now, 3 decades later, their grandchildren were standing in a church, closing the circle. Wyatt looked at Abby. She was crying quietly. He folded the letter. He tucked it safely into his breast pocket, right over his heart. He offered Abby his arm. She took it. They walked out of the church together, out into the fading Texas sun, 4:30 in the morning. The Texas heat hadn't started yet. The air was cool, dark. Wyatt woke up. It was a habit carved into his bones. He sat up. He swung his legs over the edge of the mattress. His bare feet hit the floorboards. But the bed wasn't empty. He looked back. Abby was still asleep. Her red hair spilled across the white pillow. She was breathing softly. Wyatt smiled, a real, genuine smile. He quietly pulled on his trousers and his heavy shirt. He grabbed his boots and walked barefoot down the hallway. He stepped into the kitchen. It was pitch black. He didn't light a lantern. He knew this room by heart. He walked over to the cast-iron stove. He struck a match. He fed a handful of dry kindling into the firebox. The flames caught, casting a warm orange glow across the pine floor. He reached for the coffee pot. Crash! Wyatt jumped. He looked down. In the dark, his elbow had caught the edge of a ceramic sugar bowl left near the stove. It hit the floor and shattered into a dozen white pieces. Wyatt stood perfectly still. He looked at the mess. Footsteps padded softly down the hallway. Abby appeared in the doorway. She was wearing a thick cotton robe. She rubbed her eyes, squinting against the firelight. She looked at Wyatt. She looked at the shattered sugar bowl on the floor. Wyatt looked back at her. He didn't say anything. A slow, warm smile spread across Abby's face. "You're a walking disaster, Mr. Sterling," she said softly. Wyatt let out a low, rumbling laugh. It was a sound that hadn't lived in this house for 6 long years. "I reckon I am," Wyatt said. He didn't rush to clean it up. He didn't worry about the mess. He pulled out a chair from the kitchen table. It was the chair Jessie had broken months ago. Wyatt had repaired it. The wooden leg wasn't perfectly straight. It sat a little crooked on the floorboards. But it was sturdy. It held weight. It wouldn't break again. Abby walked over. She didn't look at the broken ceramic. She just sat down in the crooked chair. Wyatt poured the water into the coffee pot. He set it on the heat. He sat down in the chair next to her. The fire crackled. The coffee began to brew. The smell of roasted chicory filled the air. They sat together in the quiet dark, waiting for the sun to rise. It wasn't a perfect life. There would be drought. There would be storms. Plates would break. But Wyatt looked at the woman sitting beside him, and he knew one thing for certain. He didn't need perfect. He just needed her. This book is a work of imagination. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are products of the author's creativity or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is unintentional and should not be construed as factual representation.
As Wyatt and Abby's story comes to an end, what remains is not simply the memory of a lonely ranch, a disputed piece of land, or a love born beneath the burning Texas sun. What remains is the quiet truth that every human being carries a story no one else can fully see. Abby was judged for her clumsy hands, her broken plates, and the rumors that followed her through Dust Creek. Wyatt was trapped behind grief, pride, and the fear of being wounded again. Both of them were misunderstood in different ways, and both had to learn that dignity is not something a person earns by being perfect. Dignity belongs to everyone, even the broken, the grieving, the awkward, the silent, and the ones who have made mistakes. The heart of this story teaches us that we should never measure a person's worth by what they fail to do gracefully. Abby may have stumbled, spilled, and burned more than a few meals, but she carried courage, intelligence, loyalty, and compassion in a world that was far too quick to laugh at her pain. Wyatt, on the other hand, had strength, land, and pride. But he still needed to learn the hardest lesson of all. Real strength is not found in shutting people out. Real strength is found in admitting when we are wrong, asking forgiveness, and choosing truth even when it may cost us something precious. This story also reminds us that judgment can be more destructive than hardship itself. A storm can tear down a barn, debt can threaten a ranch, and old papers can bring trouble to a man's door. But cruel words can wound the soul in places no one can see. The people of Dust Creek saw Abby's mistakes, but they did not see her heart. Wyatt saw her heart, then almost lost her because fear made him forget what compassion had already shown him. That is why the story matters. It asks us to look again before we condemn, to listen before we accuse, and to remember that every person deserves respect before they ever have to prove their value. Above all, Wyatt and Abby's journey is about healing. Not the easy kind that comes quickly, but the slow, painful kind that requires honesty. Wyatt had to stop hiding behind the shadow of his past. Abby had to stand firm in her truth and refuse to let another person's fear define her. Their love could only become real when both of them stood as equals, with no masks, no secrets, and no pride standing between them. And that is the deepest meaning of this tale. Love is not built by saving someone from above, but by standing beside them in the storm. So when we leave this western road behind, let us carry its lesson with us. Be kinder than the town that laughed. Be braver than the man who first ran from trust. Be as dignified as the woman who kept standing, even when the world tried to make her small. Because in the end, the greatest legacy is not land, money, or pride. It is the mercy we offer, the truth we choose, and the humanity we protect in one another.